Was there ever a more inviting introduction to a piece of music than the opening of Petrushka? Igor Stravinsky's musical imagination, when he was just 28 years old, was one of the miracles of the 20th century. Stravinsky's life was long and productive. From the exoticism and folklore of 19th century Russia to the sophistication of Paris in the 20s and 30s, and finally the internationalism of his LA-based career. His personal magnetism drew into his orbit a host of extraordinary collaborators. These talented people, as well as the whole of Western musical culture, fueled Stravinsky's prodigious creativity. He asked the listener to reimagine ballet, opera, orchestral and chamber music, folk tales, and the Greek classics. And although Stravinsky isn't usually thought of as a composer of sacred music, his spiritual search led him to compose some of the most revered religious works of the 20th century. Many of his compositions were ritual enactments of marriage, sacrifice, and death. Igor Stravinsky's father and his last name were both Polish. The paternal family had once carried a noble pedigree, but they'd become impoverished. Igor's mother came from a prosperous family of landowners in Ukraine. Fyodor Stravinsky, Igor's father, was at the beginning of his career as an opera singer when he met Anna Kolodowsky in Kiev. Against her family's wishes, they married and soon moved to St. Petersburg, where Fyodor became the leading bass baritone at the Mariinsky Theater. He became famous for his brilliant characterizations and splendid voice. Igor's mother was a pianist and an excellent sight reader, but she devoted herself to her husband's needs and to the upbringing of her 4 sons. Igor was the third to be born. He was an unusually small child and suffered from a sense of inferiority to his larger older brothers. His frequent illnesses caused both Igor and his mother excessive anxiety about his health, bordering on hypochondria. Although Stravinsky looked back on his childhood as dull and loveless, he actually inhabited an extraordinarily rich musical environment. From the age of 6, Stravinsky attended performances and was allowed to wander backstage at the Mariinsky Theater. The family lived in a 9-room apartment on the Kryakov Canal, which was just a short walk from the theater. Igor spent 5 or 6 nights a week there. Even more than opera or instrumental music, Igor adored the ballet. From an early age, Stravinsky demonstrated an astonishing ear and musical memory. As a toddler, he could recall tunes from street peddlers, hawkers, and laundresses, and pick them out on the piano. Although his parents provided piano lessons for their sons, it was unthinkable that Igor would pursue a career in music. He and his brothers were all destined for the security of the legal profession. Family life in the Stravinsky home was stable, but Igor's father was remote, and his mother favored her older boys. No one would have predicted that little Igor was a genius. The richness of life in St. Petersburg, its church bells, the winter sleigh rides, the sound of ice breaking up on the Neva River in spring, the endless train rides to remote family estates, these were Igor's earliest memories. Summer life in the country was filled with berry picking, drawing, writing and acting in family plays, and the occasional rustic fair. Igor tried to overcome his frailty by drinking fermented mare's milk. Among his many relatives, there was a family of girl cousins that he much preferred to his brothers and male cousins. Yekaterina Nosenko, called Katya, was the one he liked the most. She was almost 10 when she became devoted to her 8-year-old cousin, Igor. Igor was steeped in the music of Glinka, Mussorgsky, Rimsky-Korsakov, Borodin, and Tchaikovsky. He supplemented the music he heard at the theater by sight-reading the scores he found in his father's library. He became familiar with the vocal music of Mozart, Verdi, and Wagner. When he reached his teens, he was allowed to study music theory privately, but his parents remained firmly opposed to his growing interest in music. Igor was 20 and already in law school when his father died. Despite Igor's entreaties, his mother still insisted that he study law and continually reminded him that he had little talent. Fortunately, Stravinsky's best friend in law school was the son of Rimsky-Korsakov. When Igor summoned the courage to show Rimsky a few compositions, Rimsky took him on as a private student. Rimsky discouraged Igor from attending the St. Petersburg Conservatory, where composition students his age were far more advanced and accomplished. But over the next 4 years, Igor's awkwardness was transformed by the warmth and fatherly guidance of his relationship with Rimsky. Suddenly, Igor's ironic wit and his sense of humor became irresistible. His ability to improvise was a hit at parties. When Igor brought Katya to Rimsky's home, Rimsky blessed their future marriage with a Russian Orthodox icon, one of those traditional small paintings used for worship in a Russian home. Because Igor and Katya were first cousins, their marriage was forbidden by imperial decree. But with the help of Rimsky's family, the religious rites were performed at a remote church outside the city. Igor's rapid mastery of compositional skills was phenomenal. At the same time, the musical culture of St. Petersburg was expanding. Igor attended and performed in a concert series which promoted works by Debussy, Ravel, and other current European composers. Igor was also influenced by Mir Iskustva, an arts magazine founded by Sergei Diaghilev and Alexander Benoit. These two men were a decade older than Stravinsky. They were currently trying to integrate contemporary Russian visual art with the latest work from the West. Stravinsky still suffered from a lack of self-confidence, and competing with Rimsky's other students was painful. But with Rimsky's guidance, he composed and secured performances for a sonata, a symphony, and 2 orchestral pieces, Fireworks and the Scherzo Fantastique. Diaghilev happened to hear the scherzo and was impressed. It was a stroke of luck which would soon have life-changing consequences for everyone. Igor and Katya had been reading poetry about bees, which evidently inspired the unique orchestration of this scherzo. Rimsky died in 1908, and Stravinsky's musical world fell apart. His funeral song for Rimsky never reached audiences due to rivalry in the music scene. Composers of nationalistic Russian music were in competition with composers following Tchaikovsky, who'd favored a more international approach. Stravinsky wasn't fitting in anywhere when he suddenly received word from Paris. Diaghilev had founded a new theatrical company, the Ballets Russes. He wanted Stravinsky's impressive orchestration skills for 2 Chopin piano pieces that were to be danced in the 1909 season. It was the beginning of one of the great artistic partnerships of the 20th century. Diaghilev's legendary insight into the desires of his audience and his instinct for recognizing talent had already led to several seasons of spectacular success. Now he was preparing a 1910 season to satisfy the lust of Parisians for all things Russian. There was going to be a new ballet based on a Russian folk tale, The Firebird. The scenario and set designer would be Benoit. The choreographer would be Fokine from the Mariinsky Ballet. But with the deadline approaching, 4 established Russian composers had turned down Diaghilev's request to produce a score for the ballet. In desperation, Diaghilev hired Stravinsky, who was only 27, inexperienced and unknown. The outcome was beyond everyone's wildest expectations. The tale of the Firebird's magical powers and the triumph of the archetypal hero prince were already well developed when Stravinsky joined the production. But the marvelous coronation scene at the conclusion of Firebird was Stravinsky's own idea, and one which foreshadowed his future preoccupation with musical ritual. Since his marriage in 1906, Stravinsky had been living in St. Petersburg, but spending long summers on a property inherited from Katya's family in the village of Ust-Lug, near the border of Poland and Ukraine. It was believed that the more southerly climate of Ust-Lug would benefit everyone in the family. Both Igor and Katya had been diagnosed with tuberculosis in their teens, and Stravinsky's first 2 children, Theodore and Mika, were at risk. Stravinsky designed the small outlying summer house himself. His studio and the piano were in a private corner of the building. Stravinsky would always compose at the piano. Although he was barely 5 feet 3 inches tall, he had unusually large hands, and at the keyboard, the wide intervals between his fingers sometimes led to idiosyncratic choices when he was composing. Stravinsky divided his year into a period of retreat and composition during the summer, with cultural and social activities taking place in the winter months. In 1910, he and Katya decided to leave St. Petersburg and move their winter residence to the shores of Lake Geneva in Switzerland. The milder winter climate would be better for everyone's health, and Igor felt far more appreciated as an artist in Europe than he did in St. Petersburg. Their 3rd child, Sulima, was born. Stravinsky had joined the artistic team of Firebird late in its development, and he'd had to satisfy all of his collaborators. But after his success with Firebird, he resolved that his music and his sensibility were going to take the lead. This was a revolutionary idea in the world of ballet, where scenario, set designs, and costumes always led the music. Stravinsky had recently been composing something he thought might become a piano concerto. The piano music described a pitiful, misunderstood artist who somehow morphed into the well-known folk puppet Pierrot, in Russian, Petrushka. Diaghilev heard the music and was excited by the idea of puppets coming to life. Stravinsky's collaborator for the 1911 ballet would again be the artist and folklorist Benoit. The puppet show would take place at the pre-Lenten Shrovetide Fair in 1830's St. Petersburg. Russia's folkloric past was an inspiration for everyone involved. Benoit and Stravinsky developed the character of the frenzied and helpless Petrushka, as well as the roles of the ballerina, the Moor, and the magician. Stravinsky wrote his magical and groundbreaking score in a mere 9 months. Fokine was the choreographer, and Diaghilev's new lover, Nijinsky, danced the part of Petrushka. Stravinsky now had to outdo the spectacular success of Petrushka. For several years, he'd been haunted by a pagan prehistoric vision. An adolescent virgin girl was dancing herself to death in front of a circle of elders. This vision would become the Rite of Spring. His collaborator was Nikolai Roerich, a collector of historic Slavic customs and melodies. Roerich would also design the sets and costumes. Together, Stravinsky and Roerich planned the 2 tableaus, the Adoration of the Earth and the Sacrifice. The scenes were based on ancestor worship, tribal games, abduction, and human sacrifice to ensure the return of spring. Stravinsky had chosen simple melodies from agrarian religious rites, but the melodies were then fragmented and positioned to create maximum metric confusion and unpredictability. Barbaric rhythmic ostinatos, wildly dissonant chords, and tumultuous orchestration added to the violence. This ferocious portrayal of nature's chaos and human brutality was both terrifying and mesmerizing. The choreography of Petrushka had been innovative, but the choreography of Rite of Spring, created by the 23-year-old Nijinsky, drove the opening night audience to catcalls, hissing, booing, and fistfights. While Diaghilev was thrilled by the publicity, the exhausted Stravinsky contracted typhus and had to remain in a nursing home for several months. As it turned out, the public's negative reaction to the work was the response of a traditional ballet-loving audience. Within a year, the first concert version of Rite of Spring was one of the great triumphs of Stravinsky's life. He was carried on the shoulders of adoring fans all around the Place de la Trinité. In Debussy's words, Stravinsky had enlarged the boundaries of the permissible in sound. Stravinsky and Diaghilev now planned to build on their success with another Russian rite, the Peasant Wedding. Although this would be a purely Russian work, it's known by the French word for wedding, les noces. It would be 10 years before Les Noces was completed. As Stravinsky obsessed over books of Russian folklore, he left in his wake some charming works for smaller ensembles. He also completed his Chinese fairy tale opera, The Nightingale, which he'd begun before writing his 3 great ballets. This was the period of productive friendships with Debussy and Ravel. There were also trips to London and to Berlin, where Stravinsky was overwhelmed by a performance of Schoenberg's Pierrot Lunaire. When he returned to his home in Switzerland, his 4th child, Mylène, had just been born. Stravinsky now set off on a quick trip back to his Russian home in Ust-Lug to retrieve family icons and reference books for Les Noces. He made it back to Switzerland just days before World War I broke out. He wouldn't return to Russia for almost 50 years. The chaos of World War I was soon followed by the 1917 Russian Revolution. Stravinsky no longer had the option of returning to St. Petersburg, even though his mother was still there. Worse was the loss of all income from Katya's properties, the loss of royalties from his publisher in Berlin, and the loss of commissions from the Ballets Russes. Fortunately, the singer-sewing machine heiress Winnaretta Singer came to Stravinsky's rescue with a generous commission for a chamber work that became Renard, the Fox. Stravinsky's theatrical know-how was abundantly demonstrated in the libretto he created for his Farmyard Fable. The work featured 4 male singers and an unusual ensemble including cembalam, a hammered dulcimer whose twangy nasal sound fascinated Stravinsky for years. The music was originally supplemented by dancing acrobats, but the hilarious score stands alone, as in this performance, sung in Russian with French subtitles. At home in Switzerland, Katja's tuberculosis was getting worse, but she supervised the 4 children, their nannies, and an increasing number of relatives who'd been displaced by the civil war in Russia. Stravinsky traveled to Spain with Diaghilev's Ballets Russes, where he conducted his own works for the first time and generated much-needed additional income. He had his first extramarital affair with the current prima ballerina of the Firebird. In Rome and Naples, he and his friend Pablo Picasso got together for several weeks of fun and troublemaking. The 2 preeminent figures of 20th century art were arrested for peeing on a public wall. Picasso's drawing of Stravinsky's face was confiscated by border police, who suspected it was an enemy plan for fortifications. In 1917, Stravinsky had completed the basic score for his wedding piece, Les Noces, but he kept changing his mind about the instrumentation. We have to jump ahead to 1922 to learn how Stravinsky completed the work. With 4 pianos and 6 percussionists, Stravinsky finally achieved the brightness, clarity, and rhythmic propulsion that he wanted. In addition, there were 4 soloists, a chorus, and striking choreography by Nijinsky's sister, Bronislava. Stravinsky had created a unique libretto from his folk sources. His description of a peasant wedding used words he chose for their sound as well as their meaning. The delightful array of beers, vodka, pastries, carrots, peas, pastries, cabbage soup, the many kinds of birds, details of the marriage bed, and the archetypal emotions of bride, groom, and their parents all are described in this brilliantly constructed masterpiece. The work was dedicated to its producer Diaghilev, who wept when he first heard it. The 10-year gestation of Les Noces included the years of World War I and its aftermath. Stravinsky was creating a new vision for musical theater. He was living on the shores of Lake Geneva and bicycling around the lake to visit his fellow artists and refugees. His collaborator for L'Histoire du Soldat, The Soldier's Tale, was the writer C.F. Rameau. Because of the war, they needed a small, portable production. There were 3 spoken roles, the narrator, the soldier, and the devil, as well as a dancing princess and 6 musicians. The story was timely. A soldier on a 10-day leave is tempted by the devil to trade his violin for a magic book, which will make him rich. In the unique instrumental ensemble, we hear the first jazz influences in Stravinsky's music. Ragtime and a tango add to the modern and international atmosphere.
The soldier begins to play.
Diaghilev was annoyed that Stravinsky was making contacts and producing work on his own. The two also argued over royalties from Firebird and Petrushka. But when they were together, they'd forget their differences and abandon themselves to creative work and exuberant partying. Diaghilev had come up with a new idea, which became the theater piece Pulcinella. There would be a commedia dell'arte libretto and a musical framework taken from the 18th century composer Pergolesi. Stravinsky would refashion Pergolesi's music in his spiky modern style. Picasso's Cubism would be featured in the sets, and Diaghilev's new love interest, Leonid Massine, would be the choreographer. Pulcinella was an enormous success in Paris in 1920 and has always been popular in its concert version. Here's the Tarantella. World War I was now over, and Stravinsky and Diaghilev were ready for a revival of the Rite of Spring. 7 years had passed since its disastrous premiere. The glamorous fashion designer Coco Chanel was going to underwrite the production. She invited Stravinsky and his family to stay at her estate in Garches, outside of Paris. Stravinsky's children, Theodore, Mika, Sulima, and Milen, were 13, 12, 10, and 6. After the birth of their fourth child, Igor and Katya's marriage had become platonic. Katya's health was delicate, and she increasingly turned to her Russian Orthodox faith for comfort. Much as Igor loved Katya and his family, he was 38, vigorous, hedonistic, and attractive to women. Soon he and Coco Chanel were having a passionate affair. Igor also had a brief romance with Xenia Nikitina, a dancer at a Russian nightclub in Paris. The big change in Stravinsky's home life came when he met Vera Sudekina in 1921. Vera was tall and voluptuous, the physical opposite of Stravinsky, who was small and wiry. Vera found him the wittiest and most amusing man she'd ever met. At 32, she was on her third marriage and had led a colorful life as an actress, film star, painter, and clothing designer in Russia. She was close to Diaghilev, who introduced them, and she immediately beguiled Stravinsky by telling his fortune with a deck of cards. Within months, they were lovers and would remain devoted to each other for the next 50 years. And for the next 18 years, Igor would have 2 wives. With Pulcinella, Stravinsky had entered what we call his neoclassic period, but there remained one last composition associated with his Russian phase, the symphonies of wind instruments. In this work, we begin to hear Stravinsky's spiritual search reflected in his music. Debussy had died in 1918, and in 1920, 10 composers published a memorial for him in a French music magazine. Stravinsky's portion of the memorial was a ritual of farewell to his close friend Debussy. It was also the beginning of a musical conception of death and eternity that would run through all of his sacred works. Short musical phrases were positioned like squares in a mosaic. There were no transitions between them. The archaic brass and wind sonorities would become a hallmark of Stravinsky's sacred style. During Stravinsky's 30-year neoclassic period, he found stimulating models for his creativity in music from the past. In Sleeping Beauty, he rescored ballet scenes written by Tchaikovsky. These were followed by his one-act opera Mavra, which borrowed material from old-fashioned Russian cabaret. In his octet for winds, he used sonata forms, stately dotted rhythms, and Alberti-style basses. His youthful pronouncement that Bach was too remote evolved into a lifelong veneration for Bach's contrapuntal and harmonic mastery. As features of historic musical style increasingly became his subject matter, many critics rejected this new, unrevolutionary Stravinsky. He joked with them that his appropriations from the past were a rare form of kleptomania. Stravinsky never got over his fear of his mother. When she arrived from Russia, Igor had to conceal his private life by moving Katya and the family to southern France, first to Biarritz and later to Nice. They were now far away from his Paris life, where he rented a studio for himself in the Pleyel piano factory and an apartment nearby for Vera. He told Katya about Vera and said he couldn't live without her. He asked the two women to become friends, and to a remarkable extent they did, enabling Stravinsky to receive love and encouragement wherever he was. Igor's mother never found out about her son's double life. Stravinsky was going to need a lot of money to maintain both Katya and Vera, his 4 children, his mother, and Katya's sister's family, who was now living with them. He began to write piano compositions for his own concert use. The concerto for piano and wind instruments and a new piano sonata were both finished in 1924, right before Stravinsky's first U.S. tour. Stravinsky had already assembled suites of concert music from his famous early ballets, and he conducted these as well as performing the new piano works. In this excerpt from the piano concerto, Stravinsky draws on melodic ideas and textures typical of Bach, but they're transformed by Stravinsky's rhythmic power and striking wind instrumentation. Stravinsky's spontaneous remarks in interviews and his dandyish appearance made him a great favorite with the American press. He was described as a metallic insect, swathed in hat, spectacles, muffler, overcoat, spats, and a walking stick, or as a prancing grasshopper with an unusually pronounced nose and large lips and ears. Igor loved to shock his interviewers, professing a hatred of modern music, a hatred of Beethoven, and a hatred of the notion that music could express any emotion whatsoever. Stravinsky returned to Europe with renewed confidence, but he was now troubled by a growing spiritual anxiety. He reread the Bible and other theological literature, and he experienced startling visions. He became a regular communicant in the Russian Orthodox Church and began wearing a cross and dating his compositions by Orthodox Church holidays. At home, Katya and the children received daily visits from the local priest, Father Nicholas, who was treated like a member of the family. We can hear spiritual seeking in Stravinsky's next major work for the stage, Oedipus Rex, written in 1927. The ancient Greek play appealed to Stravinsky's ongoing obsession with ritual and atonement. He chose Jean Cocteau to create a libretto in French, which was then translated into Latin because Stravinsky wanted the purity and monumentality of an ancient language. To create the appearance of living statues, he insisted on the use of masks, a seated male chorus, and minimal stage movement. Stravinsky's somber and menacing music communicated the plight of an individual confronting a catastrophic fate. For the next few years, Stravinsky returned to his love of ballet. Apollo, like Oedipus, would be a view of classical antiquity. It was Stravinsky's first partnership with George Balanchine, a born Russian who changed his name, moved to America, and became the most esteemed choreographer of the 20th century. Unusually for Stravinsky, he scored Apollo for strings alone, and he developed a new style with longer melodic lines. Diaghilev was furious that Stravinsky was attracting new collaborators and producers. He publicly criticized Stravinsky's recent work, and the two men weren't even on speaking terms when Diaghilev unexpectedly died in Venice in 1929. Stravinsky's guilt over his relations with Katya and Vera and his shock at the death of Diaghilev were both torments that led to the anguished opening of the Symphony of Psalms, one of the 20th century's greatest spiritual works. It was commissioned by the Boston Symphony, but Stravinsky scrawled "To the Glory of God" at the top of the score. He assembled the text himself from the Psalms of David. The intense drama of the opening movement and the rigorous counterpoint in the second movement culminate in the adoration and rapt contemplation of the final movement. Stravinsky, at 48, was concertizing all over Europe. He'd expanded his performance repertoire with a second piano concerto, the Capriccio, and a new violin concerto. His partner, the violinist Samuel Dushkin, had been born into a Russian-speaking family, and Dushkin spoke Russian with Igor. Dushkin gave Stravinsky invaluable advice on violin technique, and even though Dushkin was 10 years younger, he willingly gave Igor the comfort and reassurance he always needed. The early 1930s brought the rise of Hitler and Mussolini. Stravinsky went to considerable trouble to prove that he had no Jewish blood, and he was surprisingly unsympathetic to colleagues whose lives were being upended by Hitler's policies. He admired Mussolini and had several private meetings with him in Italy. Possibly Igor's stance towards fascism was the result of his disapproval of communism and what had happened in Russia. What was most important to Igor was his deep psychological need for order so that he would be free to compose. He and Katya became French citizens in 1934. Stravinsky continued his experimentation with theater works, and he now collaborated with André Gide to create Persephone, another tale from Greek mythology. The drama described Persephone's descent into the underworld and her role in returning spring to the earth. It was dedicated to Vera. Artistic differences between Stravinsky and Gide, particularly Stravinsky's musical setting of the French language, caused Gide so much vexation that he boycotted every performance. Stravinsky and his violinist Dushkin now set out on Igor's second U.S. tour, 3 months of concerts, including his first visit to Hollywood, where he enjoyed time with Charlie Chaplin. A journalist wrote, "He has a tremendous capacity for joie de vivre, smokes 40 cigarettes a day, occasionally overeats, and invariably keeps all church holidays." After being lionized in the U.S., Stravinsky returned to Europe to face the apathetic reaction of European audiences to his recent work. He was humiliated when he was considered for a seat on the prestigious Académie Française and received only 5 of the necessary 32 votes. Nevertheless, he went on to write one of his most powerful works of the 1930s, the Concerto for 2 Pianos. It would be performed by himself and his son, Sulema, who was now 25. Tucked in between its thrilling virtuoso movements, the charming second movement provides a slow-motion opportunity to hear Stravinsky playfully truncating his themes and passing them between the 2 pianos. In 1935, Stravinsky's oldest son, Theodore, had to have an emergency appendectomy. Stravinsky's perennial hypochondria led him to insist on preventive appendectomies for himself, his other children, and Vera. Several months later, during his third American tour, Stravinsky was told that the tuberculosis he'd had as a teenager had returned. 2 important commissions led to new work. The first was from George Balanchine, who was forming the New York City Ballet. Stravinsky's lifelong obsession with card games inspired the ballet Jeu de Cartes, for which he created both scenario and music. The Dumbarton Oaks Concerto was commissioned by a wealthy Washington couple. Stravinsky made direct references to Bach's Brandenburg concertos, which caused critics to accuse Stravinsky of insolence and creative impotence. But the Baroque materials were Stravinsky's playful way of looking backward and forward at the same time. It was the essence of his neoclassicism. Stravinsky had just begun work on a symphony for his new American patrons when an appalling series of tragedies struck the family. For several years, Katya had been confined to a tuberculosis sanatorium high in the French Alps. She rarely saw her husband. When her younger daughter, Mylène, was diagnosed with the illness, Mylène joined her mother at the sanatorium and was soon followed by the older daughter, Mika. Mika had recently married and given Igor a grandchild, but now, after the stress of childbirth and TB, Mika died at the age of 30. Then Igor himself was admitted to the sanatorium, where he watched while Katya, overcome by sorrow, finally succumbed to the disease. 2 months later, Igor's mother died. This miserable 7-month period coincided with political turmoil in Europe, Kristallnacht, the invasion of Poland, and the beginning of war. Stravinsky had been offered a series of lectures at Harvard for September 1939. There didn't seem to be any reason to stay in Europe. At the age of 57, Stravinsky began a new life in America. He barely spoke English and delivered his Harvard lectures in French. There were 3 long months of visa struggles before Vera was allowed to enter the U.S. Finally, after a 19-year relationship, they were married. Like many displaced Europeans, they decided to move to Los Angeles. Stravinsky hoped the climate would prevent any recurrence of his tuberculosis. Soon after arriving in L.A., Igor was invited to Disney Studios to see the new film Fantasia, which featured portions of his 1913 Rite of Spring. He was shocked by the dinosaurs and by the changes that had been made to his score, but he couldn't pass up the royalties. He and Vera applied for naturalization and citizenship. They bought a house at 1260 North Weatherly Drive in Hollywood, where they would live for the next 30 years. Igor's LA home expressed a pleasurable new domesticity in his life. The icons, candles, and relics of the past were supplemented by Vera's eclectic taste. The house was packed with plants, memorabilia, Vera's paintings, gifts from friends, as well as 40 caged lovebirds and a parakeet. The birds often had free run of the house. For the first time, there are many photographs of Stravinsky smiling. Stravinsky's routine remained the same: a half hour of headstands and physical exercise in the morning, followed by hours of uninterrupted composing, a midday meal, and then socializing or concert engagements for the rest of the day and evening. The Stravinsky social circle was a stimulating mix of expatriates. They were composers, musicians, writers, scientists, artists, actors, and philosophers. Stravinsky finally completed his 1938 Symphony in C, but now he had to be fully engaged in writing music that would enable him to make a living in California. He wrote film scores, which could also be used as concert music. He even wrote a circus polka for Barnum and Bailey's Elephants. It ends with Stravinsky's rousing rendition of Schubert's Marche Militaire. Igor and Vera contributed to the war effort by growing vegetables in their backyard and raising chickens. It was 1945, and Stravinsky was writing his symphony in 3 movements, one of his greatest non-theatrical works. While he referred to this piece as a war symphony and sometimes offered newsreel-like scenarios for the music, he also typically denied that there was anything programmatic about it. With this work, Stravinsky demonstrated the ongoing relevance of the classical symphony in a turbulent modern world. Woody Herman, the clarinetist and band leader, commissioned Stravinsky's Ebony Concerto, which was premiered at Carnegie Hall in 1945. This wonderful study in jazz idioms was Stravinsky's last foray into the jazz world, which had inspired him since the 1920s. At the end of 1945, Igor and Vera became American citizens. As an American, Stravinsky was now protected by American copyright laws. He made subtle changes to his earlier works so that they could be re-copyrighted. At last, he had some control over his royalties. American commissions continued to come in, but he received only one European commission between 1933 and 1955. In 1946, Stravinsky again worked with the choreographer George Balanchine. Orpheus had long been imagined as a desirable sequel to Apollo, their earlier ballet from 1928. Balanchine spent the entire summer in Hollywood with Igor, the two of them planning the scenario and choreographic movement. The production's decor would be designed by Isamu Noguchi. The music's plaintive serenity is unique in Stravinsky's writing. As the archetypal tale unfolds, we hear the lyre of Orpheus as he mourns the loss of Eurydice. neon glitz of Hollywood and the relentless socializing, Stravinsky was facing another spiritual crisis. It wasn't enough to observe Christmas, Easter, the many church holidays, and the Panikhida, the yearly round of requiem services for deceased family members. In 1948, he completed a Mass that he hoped could be used liturgically in the Roman Catholic Church. Musical instruments were expressly forbidden in Russian Orthodox services. Stravinsky's Mass has a timeless, eternal quality with its scoring for the voices of men and boys and its distinctive wind ensembles. There are many moments of silence where we can hear echoes of the singing and instruments as they resound off the cathedral walls. Ever since moving to the United States, Stravinsky had planned to write an opera in English. 8 paintings entitled The Rake's Progress by the 18th century artist William Hogarth immediately struck Igor as operatic scenes. He chose the English-American poet W.H. Auden to create the libretto, and the two of them reveled in creating this lavish satirical opera. Stravinsky modeled the music on Mozart's Così fan tutti, but true to form, he included references to the entire history of Italian opera. Auden used his sophisticated literary background to enhance the tale of Tom Rakewell's descent from innocent self-indulgence to madness and death. The devil also plays a significant role in this drama, just as he did in The Soldier's Tale. Stravinsky claimed that he believed in the literal existence of the devil. Ever since the Rake's premiere in Venice in 1951, opera companies have vied with each other to produce the most outrageous versions of Mother Goose's Brothel, The Bearded Lady Named Baba the Turk, The Auction of Wives, The Turning of Stones to Bread, and a madhouse called Bedlam. In this scene, poor Tom tries to placate his former girlfriend and his new wife.
All that it can with me, unworthy am I, less than weak. Go back, go back.
It worthiness, so you still love, reside in
The Rake's Progress occupied Stravinsky for 3 years and was the pinnacle of his neoclassic exploration. During this period, a 23-year-old conductor named Robert Kraft came into Stravinsky's life. Igor was 67. Their connection began with technical questions about conducting, but evolved into an all-encompassing relationship. Within a year, Kraft was living in Stravinsky's house, and Igor, Vera, and Bob were inseparable. Critical reaction to the Rake's Progress made it clear that the European avant-garde no longer regarded Stravinsky as a significant player in 20th century music. At the same time, Stravinsky realized that he'd run out of inspiration for neoclassicism. One afternoon, while Igor and Kraft were out driving in the Mojave Desert, Stravinsky began weeping and admitted to Kraft that he feared he could no longer compose. To understand Stravinsky's dilemma, an overview of 20th century musical composition can be helpful. Throughout the first half of the 20th century, the music of Stravinsky and the music of Schoenberg were regarded as the two opposing poles of contemporary music. Since 1909, the Viennese composer Arnold Schoenberg had been developing a new technique for musical composition. Even though major and minor tonality had dominated Western music since the time of Bach, Schoenberg was interested in the potential of atonality. No single tone would prevail over the others, and to avoid any sense of hierarchy, all 12 tones of the octave would be used in a specific order before repeating any of them. The 12-tone row could be varied by mathematical procedures such as retrograde or the inversion of intervals. This type of musical thinking and tonal manipulation is called serialism. Since Schoenberg was Jewish, he'd left Europe in 1933. He'd moved to Los Angeles 6 years before Stravinsky's arrival. In the remaining 11 years before Schoenberg died in 1951, the two composers never communicated, even though they lived just a few miles from each other and attended many of the same events. Robert Kraft managed to be on good terms with both of them, and he was also conducting and recording the works of Schoenberg's fellow serialist, Anton Webern. After the death of Schoenberg, and with Kraft's guidance, Stravinsky gradually came to respect the potential of serialism as a method of composition. In fact, it became the final model for Stravinskyan exploration. Stravinsky first experimented with serial procedures in a movement from his cantata in 1952. The movement was based on words from a medieval English carol. In this excerpt, the tenor is singing a repeating pattern of 11 notes. It's not a Schoenbergian row, but the technique is similar. As you listen, the point isn't to count the tones, but to experience the music like any other music. Serial technique is the business of the composer.
Shall be my dancing day. I would my true love did so chance to see the legend of my play. To call my true love to my dance. Sing, oh my love, oh my love, my love, my love. This have I done for my true love. Then
When Stravinsky turned 70 in 1952, he wrote his septet, which included in its second and third movements a more rigorous use of tone rows. Complete 12-tone rows finally appeared in Stravinsky's Canticum Sacrum, written for St. Mark's Basilica in Venice in 1955. Igor also made formidable use of the acoustic, which had once resounded with the music of Gabrieli and Monteverdi. The development of Stravinsky's serial language took place alongside his yearly conducting tours. He spent almost half of every year in Europe, where he was welcomed by royalty and by other world-famous artists. Igor also had his share of health crises, the removal of his prostate, and a serious stroke. Although his physical energy was diminished, he adamantly refused to give up tobacco or his beloved Scotch whiskey. It's instructive to hear how Igor could Stravinskyize even the most familiar melodies. Here's his 80th birthday greeting for Pierre Monteux, who'd conducted the world premiere of the Rite of Spring in 1913. It contains fragmentation, canons, and typical Stravinsky witticisms. Stravinsky's last ballet was another collaboration with George Balanchine. Agone was an exuberant presentation of music and dance idioms. The two artists had discovered a 17th century manual of French court dances, which inspired them to combine the antique with the ultra-modern. Balanchine created constructions in space and his radical partnering techniques with 12 dancers in various combinations. Stravinsky composed each of the 12 formal sections with a different palette of sound. The thread of spiritual exploration that we found in Stravinsky's earlier works became the dominant fabric in the works of his later years. Thrani is a setting of lamentations from the Book of Jeremiah. It was premiered in 1958 in Venice. Stravinsky created a complex design where letters of the Hebrew alphabet alternate with sorrowful verses about the Jews in exile from Jerusalem. There's unpitched chanting, a device which returns in Stravinsky's other late religious works. After Aleph, we hear the chorus exclaim, "How lonely sits the city that was once full of people." Igor had become a worldwide cultural idol. He conducted everywhere: Japan, Mexico, South America, Israel, Egypt, Australia, and South Africa. There were annual trips to Europe and 5 summers in Santa Fe. Wherever he and Vera found themselves, they were eager and attentive tourists. Stravinsky wrote a theater work for television about Noah and the flood. He recorded his complete works for Columbia Records. Igor's 80th birthday year included conducting the Rite of Spring at the Hollywood Bowl and dinner at the White House with the Kennedys, whom he later described as nice kids. The highlight of his 80th year was his return to Russia after almost 50 years. At the invitation of Khrushchev, he conducted in Moscow and St. Petersburg. He met with dignitaries, friends, and relatives, and visited his childhood home, which was now divided into 3 communal apartments. It was 1962, the height of the Cold War, and Stravinsky was unable to see his Ukrainian property or even to hope that his compositions would ever become widely available in Russia. Still, the homecoming was profoundly meaningful to him. In his early 80s, Stravinsky wrote a theatrical piece in Hebrew. It was the 7th language Igor set to music, the culmination of his lifetime obsession with dictionaries and vocabularies. Abraham and Isaac was dedicated to the people of Israel. In addition to his use of serial techniques, Stravinsky's musical forms and ideas were now becoming more and more concise, possibly due to the influence of Webern, whose works he admired much more than Schoenberg's. In his final orchestral works, the movements for piano and orchestra and the Huxley variations for orchestra, Stravinsky remained, as Debussy had claimed, the most wonderful orchestral technician of our time. Stravinsky was continually learning about the deaths of his contemporaries. Over the course of his life, he'd written many memorials, beginning with Rimsky-Korsakov and then Debussy. Now, in the last years of his life, he composed memorials for Dylan Thomas, President Kennedy, T.S. Eliot, and Aldous Huxley. There remained one death to be honored with music, his own. Stravinsky's final years weren't easy. His health was a continuous concern, and the time spent in hospitals and with his doctors ate up composing time. The relationship with his 3 remaining children had been problematic since the beginning of his love affair with Vera. Everyone made efforts to keep the family together, but after Kraft came on the scene, the bonds formed by Stravinsky, Vera, and Kraft became even more threatening to Katya's children. For 3 years before Stravinsky's death, and for many years afterward, there were expensive and destructive lawsuits over Stravinsky's legacy. But for Igor, the most agonizing loss was his growing inability to write music. Kraft continually tried to provide interesting music for him to listen to, but Stravinsky was no longer interested in listening to music, not even to his own music. He was only interested in composing it. He said, "I love composing more than I love music itself." His last 2 works were the Requiem Canticles and a 12-tone setting of The Owl and the Pussycat, which he wrote for Vera. She'd memorized the poem when they were both learning English. The Requiem Canticles were a setting of the Roman Catholic Mass and burial service for the dead. The 9-movement work lasts only 15 minutes, and Stravinsky liked to refer to it as his mini or pocket requiem. The earliest handwritten score reveals Stravinsky struggling to integrate serial technique with the most potent aspects of the tonal tradition. He chose those portions of the liturgy which he personally found meaningful. He knew he was writing the Requiem for himself. In 1969, Igor and Vera sold their Hollywood home and moved to an apartment on Fifth Avenue in New York City. Vera and Kraft did what they could to keep Stravinsky alive a little longer. He was still able to joke. When Vera complained that he kept calling her name, he said, "I'm trying to make sure that I still exist." Finally, at the age of 88, ridden with pneumonia and edema, he stopped breathing. It was Easter week, and Stravinsky's New York City funeral was held on Good Friday. Immediately afterwards, his body was flown to Venice, the location of many premieres of his work and the traditional border between East and West. With fitting pageantry, there was a ceremony which included the Requiem canticles conducted by Kraft. Finally, the coffin was taken by a flotilla of gondolas to the nearby island of the dead, San Michele. Stravinsky was buried just a few yards from Diaghilev. 11 years later, Vera would join them. For this moment in time, Stravinsky had composed the ritual music which concludes his pocket requiem. First, we hear the stark, uncompromising finality of what he called the chords of death. These alternate with mysteriously orchestrated chorales of bell sounds. For Igor, the bells recalled the chimes of St. Petersburg. With this music, the greatest composer of the 20th century entered eternity.